Rory, thank you very much for that introduction. I think we probably got the same tailor. I'm interested. I come from. I'm going to probably need to run for a taxi straight away because I come from a banking background, and I'm going to talk about risk. So let me apologise straight away. And I'm interested in risk because it's part of the decision-making process. That every time you make a decision, you essentially take some form of risk assessment. You may not take an intelligent one, or you may choose to ignore it. But one way or another, we're involved in risk. And my title is called From Here to Uncertainty. And I wanted you to think of a continuum. At one end, we've got certainty. Now, we all like certainty. That's the crystal meth of decision-making. Everybody craves certainty. And down the other end, we really hate uncertainty. And you see that through things like sort of Maslow's hygiene factors and that terrible old cliche of financial markets, the market hates uncertainty. And then in the middle is this big lump called risk. And I have never met so many people now, probably not in an audience like this, but an enormous number of people who have risk or risk management on their business title. And I am not at all certain that's what they're doing. And I actually think in some cases, what they're doing might be making things worse. We shall see. So I wanted to try and find a picture that explained everything from certainty through risk to uncertainty. And I found this one. And I think you can sort of do a little bit of maths with that, whether you're the photographer looking at the cats or you're one of the cats and one of them looking at one another. Those of you of a more philosophical bent will say, well, let's take it one step further. What if we had an infinite number of boxes with an infinite number of cats? And a lot of things to do with risk are slippery. There isn't a nice defined answer. And of course, we like certainty and we like a defined answer. And I think that's kind of part of the problem. So I'm going to sort of go back in time a little bit. I think we'll go back to 2006 and we'll end up in 1921. So maybe I'm not as topical as the rest of the speakers today. And I want to go back to the financial markets of 2006 and show you a picture of how people in the financial markets saw themselves and expected everybody else to see them and how they thought they were doing. And I found this rather nice picture of Cary Grant, probably taken in the late 1950s. He's a sort of premium end of the George Clooney market, if you don't kind of remember him. He's a better George Clooney, I think, but I might be showing my age. And here he is sort of strutting his stuff in, I guess that's late 1950s England, and smooth man about town, totally on top of things. And that was the situation in risk in the financial markets, really certainly from about 1990 to 2007. We're on top of all of this. We've got all the data. So when I hear now lots of talk about big data, I think, well, yeah, banks are crunching large amounts of data. Loads of models, loads of guys with PhDs in maths. What could possibly go wrong? Now, I think the picture is not Cary Grant. I think the market was a little bit more like this guy. And one of the problems is that there's a hell of a lot of looking backwards in very great detail. This is what I call sort of Hubble telescope driving. You've polished the mirror so perfectly, but you are still only looking backwards. What was the real problem with the banks was that he was not exactly driving in first gear. They were driving at faster and faster speeds, which was a function of that risk, because they thought they could price risk more effectively. Profit margins went down through competition, so they wrote more and more risk. And as a result, things went wrong. Pretty much all decisions involve data. And I know with an audience like this, you're sort of very educated in the pitfalls of data and the pitfalls of what can happen when you sort of torture the data to death. But I want to take you back to 1981, and looking at this audience, that's a long time ago for most of you. Some of the more elderly members of the audience may have been starting out on their career, or maybe in their small bedroom playing air guitar to Duran Duran or something like that. Maybe they were doing both. But this was what was going on in 1981 for people who can't remember or who weren't there. Prince Charles got married. Liverpool won the European Cup. Cricket fans will be very pleased, or only the English ones, sorry Adam. Very famous cricket Ashes series where both of them had some remarkable results, and the Pope died. Let's just spin forward a little bit to 2005. And I think you can kind of guess what's going to come next. Prince Charles got married. Liverpool won the European Cup. We won the Ashes. It's pretty rare, so I think it's quite nice to celebrate again. And John Paul II died. So does this mean that if Prince Charles gets married and Liverpool and England do well in sport, that the Pope must die? Probably not. But you start to wonder, don't you? Now, this is a really simple example of where we have a tendency to find patterns aren't there. And my good friend Paul Craven is here today, and he's got a great library of pictures which show where we look for patterns and we see shapes. You know, the classic one where we see the burnt piece of toast and there's a picture of Russell Brand, or any other Messiah, for that matter. And that's very typical that we see what we want to see, because we want certainty. I want a solution. I want to know the answer. I want to be certain. So, one of the earlier speakers said that there are pathological liars. I'm afraid I'm one of them, because I lied to you. No Pope died in 1981. In fact, it was in 1978. It was a year of two popes, Paul VI, and then John Paul I, who was only Pope for 33 days. But when I was preparing this talk, I thought, well, three things together look quite good. But if I put in a fourth one, it kind of really looks good now. It looks even more impressive. And there is a tendency for us to fill in gaps, put in data that's not there, and we also don't have a good memory of the past. We always think that the data's always going to be available, and we think in this digital age that will be true. But it's still amazingly difficult to find, from my background, say, economic data that goes back to the 1960s. Some of the data series are just simply not there. And so within a lifetime, you wonder if this data is actually being kept. So that's the sort of cautionary tale on data. This is really all I want to talk to you about today, and it's this sort of continuum. On one side, on the left-hand side of the chart, we've got perfect certainty. Right down on the right-hand side, we've got total ignorance, which is what I call Donald Rumsfeld territory. And that's the unknown unknowns. When you have 100% certainty, you feel that you can predict everything. So we can look at Folkestone tide tables, and we can see the tide today, high tide was about 8:04, tomorrow it's about 40 minutes later, because there is past data that we can extrapolate forward. As we get less and less information, as we go down the scale, we move from risk to what is called Knightian uncertainty. And that basically says there isn't enough data to use usual models to make sensible predictions about the future. I will give you a personal example of that, a little bit more information than you want. I'm 57. The keen-eyed amongst you will have spotted that I have crested my athletic peak. I don't knowingly trouble a salad bar much these days. But I have a nephew who was in the British athletics team, and I had three grandparents who lived into their late 80s, but I had an uncle who died of a heart attack at 51. So am I going to die between now and lunch, or will I make it to my 80s? There's not enough information. But if you take all slightly overweight, not fit, enjoy a drink 50-year-olds, you can build a portfolio of uncertainties and turn it into a risk. So if you can turn uncertainties into a risk, you make money. And if you actually look at the 100% situation, you always make money. If we knew what was going to win the horse race this afternoon with absolute certainty, we would make money. Of course, you won't find a bookie who will make you a bet, and in the same way as insurance, you cannot insure a certainty. We can characterize these things as three types of things: puzzles, problems, and messes. And I want to define those for you, and in a sense, that's all I really want to leave you with today. A mess is a complex issue where we don't even know what is the proper question. Picasso famously said, "Computers are useless, all they give you is answers." But people like answers, we like certainty. The next one down is a problem, which is actually a defined issue. How should you manage your pension fund? Should I be in equities? Should I be in bonds? Should I be in cash? Should I just go and blow the lot? There are a number of scenarios you can map and plan and do, but there's not a definitive correct answer. Puzzles, there's a completely correct answer. What if you've got the time and the resources to do it? So what is the fastest way from London to Folkestone? What is the cheapest airfare from Paris to New York? If you've got the time and the resource, you can find that answer. So all issues we face are either messes, problems, or puzzles. And this is what happens. We have a tendency when dealing with a mess to carve part of it off and call it a problem, and then solve it, or think we've solved it as a puzzle, and then say, job done. We've done that. I've solved that problem. You marketing guys, I'm not a marketing person, know the power of the word solution. Companies have the word solution in their job title, in their corporate titles. As a solution, you're offering a solution because you're implicitly solving the puzzle. And my contention is that, like a lot of things in life, the problem is not the answer, it's asking the right question. You need to understand, are we in a mess? Are we in a problem, or are we in a puzzle? And use the appropriate tools. I've referenced a couple of sources there, Michael Pidd and the original stuff on messes, problems and puzzles of Russell Eghoff. So just to finish, when you next meet somebody with risk management in their business title, or they're running a risk management department, chances are they're measuring. They're not necessarily managing risk. And what they need to be doing is identifying risk. We need to spend much more time thinking about how we ask the question, how we can get the information level up so that we can make sensible risk decisions. Now, I'm slightly disappointed with Rory, actually. I must just say this publicly right at the end, because he's missed what I think would have been one of the greatest risk experts to have had at this talk. And there's no great excuse, really, Rory, because he lives down the coast, and you really should have got a cab and got him along. And unfortunately, he can't be here today, as far as I know, though from what you say earlier, Rory, he's actually played on this stage. And I, of course, refer to Keith Richards of the Rolling Stones, one of the greatest people in terms of exposure to risk, I would have thought, in a number of ways. And he actually has a great quote, which he doesn't mean in this context. But if you don't remember anything else of this little quarter of an hour, try and remember this quote. His quote was, "Everyone talks about the rock these days. The problem is they forget about the roll." And I want to suggest to you, everybody talks about certainty, solutions. Give me the answer. The real trick is to start thinking about the role, the uncertainty, the gaps, to really question how you ask your questions. So there we are, rock and roll from Folkestone. Thank you.
Thank you. That business of effectively taking part of a mess or part of a problem and pretending it's a puzzle, or effectively you hive off the bit that makes it interesting
and you
solve
break the
what
links.
Remains.
Yeah, the point I may have not made enough is you break off the links, and I think maybe for another time or another occasion, that one of the great lessons that's going to come out of complexity is the network is so important. It's all the linkages and things.
I read a very strange blog post the other day, which was very, very interesting, which is that no one would disagree with this in the field of design, nor would I disagree that the London Underground map is actually a masterpiece of design. And yet this blog post actually proposed banning it and replacing it with a varied series of maps with some randomness built in, simply because the problem with the tube map is that it's so good that it creates an impression of certainty that actually doesn't belong there. For example, it doesn't show the rail network at all. It misrepresents the distance between Paddington and
the River Thames is all screwed up.
The River Thames is completely screwed. So they had this very interesting point, which is the problem, and you could actually apply that to neoclassical economics. It's not necessarily a problem because it's all bad. But the fact that it actually is so easy to use and so plausible means that it can actually be so good that it's dangerous, which I think is I've never read that opinion before. It was such a divergent and strange counterintuitive opinion. This is a very good map. We should deliberately get rid of it. And actually, I can now see a kind of logic. We're allowed, by the way, one flash question. Because apparently we're a bit pressed for time, so I'm going to give anybody about 5 seconds.
Or will I escape?
Yes, gentleman there.
Thank you. I've been doing some work recently with Dave Snowden, works on complexity theory, and he posits within his research that an issue with something being so complex is how we collect data. So the way in which we collect, whether it's through questionnaires, he states that through narrative is the most effective way to collect and then use qualitative data after that through triads. And I was wondering what your opinion is on whether narrative can minimize the level of complexity and if that would be effective.
Yeah, I guess I'm going to say yes and no. I think first off, as I said earlier, we're sort of pattern hunting machines. We're also natural storytellers. We constantly either tell one another stories or run stories in our heads. One of the downsides to that is the sort of shortcut heuristic, where we rush for the solid answer all the time. I think it's really very difficult to shake off this desire for the answer. Give me the facts, give me the solution, do it now. Whereas narrative is much more muddy, much more messy, if you like. I think, just to finish off, I think what's going to happen with complexity theory is going to be a lot of work, it's more going to be complexity practice in how we look at all these different links and their strengths, and some are two-way flows and all the rest of it. And I think this is where there's going to be a lot of work in risk and decision-making that's going to come from biology and evolution.
Well, that's a perfect link to the next speaker, Nicola Raihani.
Thank you
very much, Gerald. That's actually fantastic.